Hello again. As the chair of the Montclair Literary Festival, I welcome you to our first 2024 event, but certainly not our last. Please mark your calendars for our festival week, which runs from April 27th through May 4th, with over 30 events and climbing. We also have a few special guests during the rest of the year. On May 14th, we are hosting Harlan Coben. June 11, Eric Larson. September 5, we're our own Garth Risk Halberg. And on September 25th, Nicholas Kristof with the library's Open Book, Open Mind series. And then maybe a few more after that. The Literary Festival would not be possible without our generous partners and sponsors. First, I want to thank our collaborative partners, Montclair State University, Watchung Booksellers, and the Montclair Public Library, as well as our community partners such as AAPI and Out Montclair. I want to also thank our major sponsors, Rayo Sauce, Sotheby's Principals, Kate Madonna and Paul Gold, Sisters in Script, West of Hudson, Stacy and Michael Kilkenny, Carolyn Gould, Karen and Kevin Wirtschafter, Angela Calley, Suna Cheng and Michael Potenza, Liza Cohen and William Wallach, the Bravitas Group, and the Harmony Day Spa, as well as all of our buddy sponsors, our book buddy sponsors, and volunteers. Your support is critical. That's what allows us to have this festival. Without our sponsors, we wouldn't be able to, because 90% of the events at the festival are free. All right. We also go into the schools this year, and that is a free event where we bring authors. All right. If you are not currently a sponsor, please consider it. Besides the benefits of VIP seating and free books, all profits from the festival go to helping the Succeed Together programs, which are life-changing. Finally, I want to spend a moment to acknowledge the accomplishments of Katrina Browning, who, unfortunately, is leaving to move to London at the end of the school year. Katrina has been the communications director for both the festival and Succeed Together. She has also been part of the executive festival programming committee, including planning tonight's panel, and has overseen the detailed administration and coordination of the festival's authors and volunteers. She did it all with amazing efficiency and grace. Katrina, we can't thank you enough. And unfortunately, it will take 3 people to replace her. I'm serious. That is another reason I'm asking every one of you to become a sponsor to help pay for her replacements, please. I now turn the mic over to Katrina to introduce tonight's extraordinary authors. I love these 2. Take care.
Thanks, Marcia. It is a bittersweet night for me. I thought I might cry, and I might actually, but it's great that I am able to introduce these 2 authors tonight. So we know Rebecca Makkai. She's the author of the novel I Have Some Questions for You, the one that we're talking about tonight, plus also The Great Believers, The 100-Year House and The Borrower, and the story collection Music for Wartime. A finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, The Great Believers received an American Library Association Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, among other honors, and was named one of the 10 best books of 2018 by the New York Times. A 2022 Guggenheim Fellow, Makkai is on the MFA faculties of the University of Nevada, Reno at Lake Tahoe, and Northwestern University, and is the artistic director of Story Studio Chicago. She lives on the campus of the Midwestern boarding school where her husband teaches and in Vermont. Is that correct? Yeah. And we're so pleased to have Julie here as well. These are two first-time authors to Montclair. So Julie was born and raised in California, and she is also the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. And her first novel, When the Emperor Was Divine, won the 2003 Asian American Literary Award and the 2003 American Library Association Alex Award. Her second novel, The Buddha in the Attic, was a finalist for the National Book Award 2010 and won the 2012 Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction and the 2011 Langham Prize in American Historical Fiction. The Buddha in the Attic was an international bestseller and the winner of the prestigious Prix Féminin Étranger 2012 and the Albatross Literature Prize 2013. And her latest book, The Swimmers, won the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction in 2023. Thank you both for coming tonight.
The button on the top, I think. Is mine on? Okay. You need to slide it from off to on. There's a little dial, like a little switch on the top. Yeah.
No?
There you
okay,
go.
here we go. So good evening. Rebecca, congratulations on the paperback release of your new novel.
Yeah, thanks.
I first ran across your work in 2011. I was listening to Selected Shorts.
We were on the same episode,
We
I
had
think. I remember
the
that.
same program,
Yes.
and I didn't know anything about you at that point. And then I heard your story. I think it was read by Victor Garber.
Yes.
It was called The Briefcase. And I was just blown away. It was like this perfectly realized short story. It was almost like a fairy tale, and it was very Kafkaesque. And for those of you who've not read it, it's about a prisoner who escapes a convict line and takes on the identity of another man, right?
Yeah.
So I really imprinted upon you as somebody who seemed to inhabit the soul of a very old, very wise Eastern European writer. So now here we are, 5 books later, and your new book could not be more different, although I realize that both stories feature the wrong man being sent to jail for a crime he did not commit. Yeah.
Interesting.
But so the new book, it's wonderful.
Thank you.
It's extremely timely. It's also very, very funny. And it's narrated by Bodie Kane, who's returning. I'm so sorry.
I was saying before, I have the hardest time with these, and at one time I was on stage and I tried to adjust it, and it flung my earring out of my ear and into the face of the person I was talking to on stage.
Oh no.
Sorry.
I'll just hold it to my ear. So the new book is narrated by Bodie Kane, and she has just returned to Granby, her high school alma mater, boarding school in New Hampshire. So do you just want to sort of set the story up and tell us who Bodie is and why she's returned to Granby?
Yeah, I can tell. Yeah, so she's 40 years old. She's a professor of film history, and she has a podcast about film history. And she's invited back just for 2 weeks in the dead of winter to teach these kind of mini courses at the school that she attended, where she was kind of, a very adrift teenager, as most teenagers are. She's teaching 2 different courses. One's on film history and one is on podcasting. And one of her podcasting students wants to take on as her project what she sees as the old-timey 1995 murder of one of Bodie's classmates. And this was someone Bodie knew but was not close with. And this young woman in the class believes, as do a lot of people online, that the wrong person has been convicted for this murder and is sitting in prison. It's not something Bodie has wanted to look at much more closely in the intervening years, but she gets drawn back in very quickly and starts to realize that if nothing else, the investigation was very much not thorough. And we go from there.
Great. So I heard you say in some interview that you had originally conceived of the novel as the world's worst high school reunion.
Yeah.
So I was curious, have you attended any of your own high school reunions?
Honestly, this is really so. Only one, and this is very funny because we were talking backstage. I live because my husband teaches there. I live on the campus of the boarding school that I attended as a day student many years ago, and so despite living there, I've only been to one reunion, which was basically my 26th because of COVID. A big deal for the 26th reunion. And I really only went because they were giving me an award.
Oh, no.
But I had a great time. It was delightful. I just, it was not the kind of thing, I didn't have that feeling of like, oh, I want to go back and reconnect because that's been, so much of my life. And even actually just a delightful part of book tour, I don't know if you experience this too, is any city that I'm in, there are people from high school or college, or I think a friend from grad school is here tonight. Like everywhere I go, there's someone. And then you reconnect in this other way and not in the pressure of everybody getting drunk together at once.
Right.
Yeah, but I did initially conceive it, that right now, if we'll be careful because I think a lot of people haven't read it, but in the second half, or really the last third of the book, part 2, they're all gathered in a hotel because there's a legal proceeding and there's really only one place to stay in this town where the courthouse is. And I originally conceived the whole book to be that. Everyone's trapped in a hotel. My entire career has been trying to rewrite The Westing Game by Ellen Raskin, which was my favorite book as a child, which is about people who all are in an apartment building together. I keep trying to do that, and then I make fun of myself for it, but it's a really good book. But that was originally the plan, and I realized it was not a great structure for many reasons. But that was the initial idea, is like, what if they're all stuck in this one hotel? Because it's a small town and no one, unlike, if you look at something like the Adnan Syed, Heyman Lee case that the first season of Serial was about, they're reconvening for court proceedings, but most of those people still live in Baltimore, versus people who went to high school in the woods somewhere. No one lives there. You're all going to have to stay in the same place. And that intrigued me, but it's now only a small part of the book.
Got it. So, I very much read this as a Me Too novel. Did you conceive of it as a Me Too novel, or did you begin to write it before Me Too, and then Me Too happened and you sort of just mapped that onto your pre-existing story, or?
It was both. So I was thinking about the book for years. And then I really thinking about it for about a year. And I started typing in spring of 2019, which was, the initial Me Too stuff had happened, mostly in Hollywood. And then over the next couple of years as I was writing, one interesting thing was that there were starting to be stories from the literary world. And in some cases, very complicated stories, right? Where it's like, well, I think we all, within the Me Too plotline, I think for everyone, there's been a story or two where you're like, well, but that one's different, right? Like, these ones are, are we really putting these all in together? For some people, for instance, the Aziz Ansari story just felt really different and didn't feel like it belonged in the same category. There were stories like that. There were also stories involving people I knew that, within the literary world, I'm sure for you too, that I just had very complicated, confusing feelings about. I didn't have a thesis statement. I didn't have answers. I just was befuddled. And at a certain point, there was like one kind of lesser known one. It was really bothering me. And I was like, the only thing I know how to do with this is kind of write it into the book. It was already, though, I could see it's a Me Too novel in two ways. One is that she's really looking back on high school teachers, boys she went to high school with, people who acted really inappropriately. But there's also a plot line involving her husband, her ex-husband. And I'll say the stuff about the high school, that was always there from the beginning, because you think back on high school and that's just the stuff that comes up. The stuff with her husband, that's the one that came in later.
Okay. So one of the things that you do in the novel that I really love is that you weave in these sort of choral litanies of stories of violence against women.
Yeah.
And it's very, very effective and affecting. And most of the novel is told in a very straightforward, realistic mode. But these choral interludes, they have an almost ghostly feel, and they're really, really haunting. So I was wondering, could you just read the first 2 pages
Yeah,
of the
I'd be
novel?
happy
Because
to.
it's a great example of one of these choral litanies. It's really
Yeah.
beautiful.
Be really happy to. Yes, it's not the prologue, because if you put prologue on top, nobody reads it, but it comes before chapter 1, so make of that what you will. All right. You've heard of her, I say, a challenge, an assurance, to the woman on the neighboring hotel bar stool who's made the mistake of striking up a conversation, to the dentist who runs out of questions about my kids and asks what I've been up to myself. Sometimes they know her right away. Sometimes they ask, wasn't that the one where the guy kept her in the basement? No, it was not. Wasn't it the one where she was stabbed in? No. The one where she got in a cab with different girl. The one where she went to the frat party, the one where he used a stick, the one where he used a hammer, the one where she picked him up from rehab and no. The one where he'd been watching her jog every day. The one where she made the mistake of telling him her period was late. The one with the uncle. Wait, the other one with the uncle. No. It was the one with the swimming pool, the one with the alcohol in, with her hair around, with the guy who confessed to right, yes. They nod, comforted. By what? My barstool neighbor pulls the celery from her Bloody Mary, crunches down. My dentist asks me to rinse. They work her name in their mouths, their memories. I definitely know that one, they say. That one, because what is she now but a story to know or not know. A story with a limited set of details, a story to master by memorizing maps and timelines. The one from the boarding school, they say. I remember the one from the video. You knew her? She's the one whose photo pops up if you search New Hampshire murder, alongside mugshots from the meth-addled tragedies of more recent years. One photo, her laughing with her mouth but not her eyes, suggesting some deep unhappiness, tends to feature in clickbait. It's just a crop shot of the tennis team from the yearbook. If you knew Thalia, it's easy to see she wasn't actually upset, was simply smiling for the camera when she didn't feel like it. It was the story that got told and retold. It was the one where she was young enough and white enough and pretty enough and rich enough that people paid attention. It was the one where we were all young enough to think someone smarter had the answers. Maybe it was the one we got wrong. Maybe it was the one we all collectively, each bearing only the weight of a feather, got wrong.
It's so great.
Thank you.
It's interesting because they're almost poetic, in form, these litanies, and they're actually really beautiful, but the subject matter is just very, very disturbing, so it's just an interesting contrast.
I was thinking, that means, I'm hoping you have all read Julie Otsuka's work, but if you haven't, oh my God. But like what you managed to do, especially in The Buddha in the Attic, but I think in really all of your work, you have this kind of poetic litanies yourself that are, I think, working on a different level than mine, but so that means a lot coming from you. So thank you very much.
No, you had me from the very first, sentence. You've heard of her. There's something very rhythmic about the prose. It just really flows.
Thank you.
I was just drawn in from the first page. Yeah. So the book at times is addressed to a you, who's referenced in the title. So do you want to tell us a little bit about who this you is?
I can. This is not a huge spoiler because you learn this guy's name very early on, like at the end of the first chapter. But there's more that develops later. But yeah, she's basically kind of, I would say, thinking the whole thing at her high school music teacher, whose name is Mr. Block. And he's someone who, was very close to the students, was a real mentor for her, was, one of those teachers who's just, really in his students' lives, and in retrospect, perhaps way too much so, and was really problematically close to Thalia Keith, the young woman who ended up murdered, but was not looked at by the police. And so, that's something that she's re-examining throughout. And, that second person, it's not a letter, it's not that she's writing a book to him, it's really just that she's thinking at him in the way that we sometimes do, maybe someone who has departed your life, or maybe just you return to a certain place, or you're really, really mad at someone, and you're just kind of narrating at them. That's basically the mode of telling that I adopted.
Yeah, I mean, it really worked for me. And I would sometimes, read for a page or two, and I'd forget, and all of a sudden you would be there, and it was a little bit jarring, but in a good way, but it's slightly creepy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that I do mean for, every time that comes up, I know because I'm rereading my own work, and you see what that effect is, that it is that jarring kind of, we're implicated in this as well. And the title came much later. We were, in copy edits by the time we settled on the title, but putting that you in the title, where readers are going to see that you before they know who it's referring to, hopefully, might start off kind of friendly and then be kind of accusatory as you realize what the book is about. Hopefully.
And then towards the end, I think there is the section that begins with, "I have some questions for you," and that was just really shocking. Yeah.
And that's where the title came from, because this was me frantically flipping through the manuscript going, is there a title in here somewhere? Oh my God.
Titles are hard, very, very hard.
Yeah.
So I love the Me Too subplot with Jerome. So Bodhi's husband, Jerome, he's been Me Too'd, and Bodhi finds herself, to use her own words, and I love this verb, scampering to his defense and standing by her man despite her otherwise very strong feminist stance. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about this subplot? It's very complicated and very good.
Yeah, it's, and it's the mildest of spoilers, because it's not like, we're not saying like whodunit here, but this is someone, she's separated from her husband at the time of the book begins. And he's basically, kind of accused by, he's a visual artist. He's accused by another visual artist online of having been predatory towards her, although Bodhi's point of view on that is, that she was a consenting adult. He was older than her, but they were both consenting adults, and they dated, and he maybe wasn't a great boyfriend. Is that predatory behavior just because he's 10 years older or however much? It's really interesting. I was trying to create a case that could really reasonably, in the Twitterverse, online, really could have people coming down on either side of it. And Bodhi is very much like, he might have been like not a great boyfriend, but he did absolutely nothing wrong. And she really sees a real divide between that and, the actual predatory behavior of a high school teacher towards an underage student. It's been interesting to me seeing kind of like things on Instagram or hearing from book clubs. It seems like basically everyone over the age of like 35 is like, he did nothing wrong, what's the problem, I don't get it. And people under the age of about 30 are like, I cannot believe she's defending this violent monster. Which is good, right, I guess. It's been fascinating, like, this is a real generational thing here, wow.
And she's not Jasmine Wilde. Also, your names are great. Jasmine Wilde. And she's not a neat and tidy victim. We don't know.
Right.
Because she also, I love the part that, so Bodhi drunk tweets from the bathtub one night, defending her husband. And then the next day she wakes up to an angry response from Jasmine. And it starts as a person of color. And as far as Jerome knew, she sounds like she presented as a white woman. She's got blue eyes, and so I wasn't. Is she a person of color? Is she not?
I was just trying to kind of, get into as much of that muck. You see these things unfold online.
It was so true to life. It really rang true.
Good, thank you. It was fun. It felt very cathartic to write, because you see, you see people. I certainly have stepped in it on occasion, and not like that, but in one way or another. And you get people going, I can't believe that you're, using your position of privilege to whatever. And there's a certain way of talking. What's useful here is that I have found the internet to be a particularly unsatisfactory place to debate or dissect these very important issues, especially Twitter, where you're limited to these, small, bite-sized things and you can't edit. And so, my impulse on most of those things is just like, keep your mouth shut, don't get into it because this is not the forum for it. But then the novel can be in a really fun way. I had a lot of fun dissecting, and again, like I don't land on some thesis statement. I don't land on an Aesop's fable moral on this. But it was cathartic for me to work out in detail and at length some of these things. And I would hope that, the book club that gets into this conversation about this nitty-gritty, that's a safe and more useful place to have those conversations and to say things like, I feel like a bad feminist when I say this, or sometimes I wonder, or I'm of two minds about this, which you can't say on Twitter.
Right.
You can't say I'm of two minds about this on Twitter.
Right.
So hopefully, that's the kind of conversation that, books spark too, right? Is more lengthy, nuanced conversations, even if it's about fictional things.
Yeah. One thing I wondered, I thought that you set up a really interesting contrast between Jasmine having more worth as a Me Too victim if she's also a person of color versus Thalia Keith having maximum worth as a murder victim in terms of clickbait and which stories sell if she's beautiful, young, and white, and rich as well. Was that something that you were deliberately trying to set up?
I think that it was subconscious as I was writing it, just kind of going, both of those things happen. It's this weird double-edged sword, right? And certainly, though, I think the bigger emphasis there is on, basically, to back up a little bit. In the big picture, the project of the book in many ways was to say, okay, that perfect clickbait story with that, just like all the elements that people couldn't possibly look away from, which includes wealth, includes privilege, does include whiteness. It's a young, beautiful woman. Let's actually look at a story like that. Let's take that kind of story that we love to romanticize and fetishize and tell, in the most lurid ways possible. And let's look at it, I'm not setting out to write a traditional mystery novel here. Although you do by the end of the book basically know who did it, but I wanted to look at all of that through a lens of realism. Realism about the criminal justice system, about the carceral system, about the media, about those investigations, about the way that what outside attention does to a case like that. And Thalia being that kind of, the young, white, beautiful, privileged girl is the thing that has centered her case in both terrible ways and ultimately in beneficial ways, even though, and then of course the students who are helping Bodhi are very conflicted about this too, almost talk themselves out of helping because why this case and not another case, and why, basically it's all a big mess, which is what I was...
It's like Britt, so Bodhi's student, she says she doesn't know if she's the right person to be making this podcast because she's a young white girl. And, she doesn't want to be accused of being a white savior. Right. But then she just goes ahead and does it anyway. Is she just virtue signaling? Or, I thought it was, again, it was just, nothing is, nothing's black and white.
Yeah. And there's a sense in which I think in all of this, you could call it satire in that I think for satire to work, it needs to not choose sides, right? It needs to kind of poke fun at everyone equally. But my intent here isn't satire necessarily, right? This is not, like I said, this is the lens of realism. This is not an exaggerated kind of farcical version of things. So maybe, I don't know, there needs to be another word for it. It's maybe satire adjacent, where it's like, I want to just poke at everything I can poke at and see what happens.
You really, you did a great, you just took on everything in this novel. It's really great.
It's amazing that this book is not 2,000 pages long.
I cannot believe she's doing this.
It wanted to be.
So can we talk about Omar for a second?
Yeah.
So the book it's a very powerful indictment of the criminal justice system and wrongful incarceration, which disproportionately affects Black men.
Right.
And so throughout most of the book, Omar is absent. And then at a certain point, you begin to splice in these real-time scenes of what is happening to him in prison while Bodhi is visiting Granby. So how did you decide how much of a presence that Omar should be in the novel?
This was the thing that I feel like every novel contains in its writing just a cosmic impossibility that almost cancels out the possibility of the novel. And this was the one for me. Like I can't write this novel. It can't exist. I wanted to write a story about, in many ways, that absence, right? Like this person, we have not heard his voice for 2 decades, and the point of view of someone like Bodhi kind of very slowly becoming aware of the fact that although she has felt like an outsider in many ways all her life, she has in fact been a part of these, very much a part of these same institutions that she felt like an outsider in. She's still a part of them. For instance, the school, she felt like an outsider there, but she's still part of this school that then got this investigation solved really quickly and gave her this life, and really tossed this young man Omar's life away. So how do I have that without replicating the marginalization and silencing of this person? I'm not the person to write the back and forth story that half of it is what is it like inside the New Hampshire State Prison for Men for a Black man. I want to read that, but you don't want me to write that. So how do I balance this? And ultimately, we do get his voice late in the book, but that wasn't enough for me, and I was really struggling with this. And so what I realized, and this was down to, we were in the editing process, and I came back to my editor and I said, oh, don't worry, I've solved it. I just need to do something with the timeline, which is one of the scariest things you can say to an editor. We're like almost on copy edits. Like, I'm just gonna redo the timeline. She was like, I was like, no, trust me. Because I wasn't restructuring the book. It was a matter of going, wait, she's telling this story from several years further on, right? She knows more at that point than she knew in the moment. And we can use that where she now knows what Omar was going through, and I won't be a spoiler, but there's certain kind of very dramatic events that he was going through while she's
it's really awful.
Right.
It's sort of appalling.
While she's very slowly becoming aware of herself and of what's going on, he's going through this crisis. And it could overlap those timelines in a way that made him more present, even in a story in which his absence is a big part of the point, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, I did a lot of research into, it had to be very specific to New Hampshire, to the criminal justice system in New Hampshire, and to specifically the New Hampshire State Prison for Men. It was high COVID when I was writing this. I did not get inside the prison during COVID, but I was able to not only talk with, I was able to talk with formerly incarcerated people, so basically people I already knew, but I was also able to work with this wonderful public defender from New Hampshire who was able to tell me just kind of, absolutely horrifying stories that, so I wasn't, having to exaggerate or make things up or guess. I was able to hopefully write pretty realistically about what, at least what's a very few aspects of that life would be like.
And is it true that in New Hampshire that they do not record confessions?
Right.
I mean, I find that amazing. But
Yeah, there are it's like a large handful of states that do not require the recording of custodial interrogation, meaning like they could interrogate you for 40 hours and none of it's recorded. And at the end, they're coming out of there with a signed confession, but no one in the courtroom ever knows what happened up until that point. I was looking, I chose New Hampshire just because I was like, well, that's a logical place for a boarding school to be. And then that was one of the things where I was like, these moments where you're like, this is terrible, and it's great for my book, but this is like, this is terrible. But yeah, I think that we're learning, I think most people are learning more and more about false confessions recently. And this is one of the reasons they happen, one of the many reasons they happen.
Wow. So this is the question I've been dying to ask you. So Rebecca is also a highly acclaimed short story writer. I think you have the record for having 4 stories in a row in the Best American Short Story
I don't know if it's
series.
it might be, like, the record's tricky because it's like, since they started having guest editors versus before, but it's maybe, let's say it's a tie with some people, I don't know, something like that.
We'll say that. But there's a short story of yours that I read in Harper's in 2021 called Women Corinne Does Not Actually Know. And when I find a story that I really love, and this one really intrigued me because of its structure, I tear it out and I keep it in my files, which I did. I didn't know I would be talking to you on stage 3 years later. But so I went back and I reread it.
Yeah.
And it's really, it's a very different narrative voice. But there's so many similarities.
Yeah.
So both Corinne and Bodhi were raped in college while unconscious. And that's only referenced in the novel and maybe like 2 or 3. It's very just briefly sort of mentioned, but it's obviously a big thing. Both Corinne in the short story and Bodhi in the novel are visiting another town for work reasons and begin to obsess either about the rapist or, in Bodhi's case, Mr. Block.
Yeah.
Both stories feature a disturbing news story about a woman who's been assaulted that's constantly on in the background. Both are having affairs with married men.
Yeah.
So I was really, can you talk about the connection between,
Yes.
were you working something out in the short story?
You are the first person to ever ask me this. I'm very
Oh,
excited
no, I
about
was
this.
really, because I remember loving that story.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear what you have to say about
So
this.
what else? I think you'll definitely talk to certain writers, and they'll talk about how, they wrote a short story and then it grew into a novel. And I've had that experience before. My second novel, The 100-Year House, it started as a terrible short story that I never published, and then it grew into the novel. But in this case, it was more, I was starting to work on this book, and then also, and I can't remember exactly the timeline, but basically, this other character and these other circumstances of Corinne in this short story came clearer and sharper to me. It's almost like it's like I don't know what the word for it is. It's not a microcosm. That's not the word. But sort of like maybe a study, right? Like a painter will do a study of one person that they're going to paint or a room, but in a very off-kilter way because she's not the same person. She's not dealing with the same exact things. But I think there's the same edge and the same kind of the same obsession and the same kind of introspection that doesn't ever quite get there. So yeah, I guess that's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it like a study. But I wasn't thinking that actively about this book when I was writing it, and I wasn't thinking back that actively on that story.
So when did you when did you write it?
You just said what year it came out, and I
2021.
2021.
Yeah.
I probably wrote it in 2019. I definitely started it before 2020 because I started it in a hotel, and that was before 2020. So,
Right. You were traveling.
So yeah, maybe even earlier. The fact that I was working on a short story in a hotel room instead of working on my novel probably means the novel was stalled out in the early stages.
Okay.
So, my
So
best
and the
recollection.
structure. So it's made up of these sections, and each section is named after a different woman whom Corinne does not know. And I wish I'd come up with that structure. It's such a good idea.
Thank you. Yeah, it was. That was. Yeah, I think it often, with my short work, sometimes with my long work too, it does help me to have like a structural scaffolding of some kind. And I'm not the most experimental writer in terms of form, but I love it when someone writes, something like Dear Committee Members by Julie Schumacher, right? Is that her name?
I've not read
yes,
it, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Julie, it's so good. You haven't read it? It's
No.
It's so good.
Okay.
The whole novel is written as a series of letters of recommendation.
Oh, that's great.
From this one
great.
unhappy guy in this one English department. It's one of the best academic satires out there. And she just kind of set herself this scaffolding, and it works so beautifully. So I love things like that, and I sometimes like using that to a certain extent. And there are things in the book, beyond, there are those litanies, that those lists she keeps coming back to, but there are also these kind of speculative
Yeah,
sections
I
where
would
she's-
say it is. I mean, you get a little meta at times. It is
Yeah.
experimental, I would say,
Right.
in points. Yeah.
And it's for me, it's that kind of that formal, like, I'm going to do this thing 10 times throughout the book, and it's kind of going to be this little bit of a framework or, a skeleton in some way.
Do you want to talk about those speculative
We can talk-
chapters? Yeah, because
yeah.
there are 9, I think there are 9
sounds
chapters
right.
in which Bodhi just imagines a different person committing Thalia's murder. And one of them is, I did it, Bodhi did it.
Yeah.
It's very, very funny. But when in the writing of the novel did you come
Yeah.
up with the idea for those chapters?
Right. Okay. So in the first one is basically her saying, "Okay, I've believed for years that Omar did it. Let me see if I can think through what that would look like." And she really can't. And that's where she starts to go, "This doesn't make sense." And then there are subsequent ones. What if this friend of hers did it? What if, et cetera. This did not work. My initial attempt at this was part 1, which is she kind of returns to the school to teach, and we end with her getting involved, and there's a little bit of a discovery. And then there was part 2, which was they've reconvened in this hotel, there's a legal proceeding. And my first draft that I showed my editor was all of part 1, and then 9 sections of other, here's like all the possible endings.
Oh, all just clumped together.
Yeah, all clumped together. So that you'd be reading, and then it didn't even explain. It was like, Omar did it, and here's how. But then you'd read the next one, it would be like, no, actually. It was a lot, actually, like the ending of Clue, the 1980s movie, where if you watch it on video cassette, it was like, it ends, it's like, that's how it could have happened, but how about this? And I did not realize that at the time, but I did watch that movie a lot as a child, and looking back,
That's funny.
I just tried to write Clue. It didn't work. It was just this big weight in the middle of the book, and that people were going to zone out after a couple of them. My editor wanted me to cut them, and I knew there was something in there that I wanted. I knew that wasn't it. So I instead was like, okay, what if I, weave them through, and this is more clearly stuff she's thinking through rather than kind of the book positing these things.
And they arise very organically of the moment that you're writing about.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. In the time when, because she would be thinking those things through, right? You're trying to go, this person that I know and trust, would it be possible for them to do something like this? What would that look like? And you try to, I guess I don't go around suspecting my friends of murder, but you know what I mean, like that kind of situation, maybe writ small.
I was hoping one of them would be devoted to Jenny Osaka, my namesake.
Right. Oh my gosh. Yes, that's very close. Yeah, I love it. That's your. Let's say that's your alter ego.
Chapter number 10.
Yeah.
No, I mean the names of the students are really. I don't know why they're funny, but Pooja Sharma. It's like a Benetton ad. It's like Pooja Sharma and Robbie Sereno and Beth Doherty, the popular. But they're. I don't know. Like, how did you come up with those names?
Okay,
they're so
so
good.
most-
And Dane Rubra is the name of the
Yeah.
YouTuber. I mean,
Yeah.
there's such good and funny names.
Thank you. Almost all of the names you just mentioned, I made up. So this was actually really fun. So I knew that I was going to need a lot of names because, like, you think back on high school and it's just this, all the names come back to you of all these people. So in the summer of 2020, all these indie bookstores were really struggling to survive and, doing all these deliveries and everything. And then it was Amazon Prime Day. And so I wanted to do something for the indie bookstore in the town in Vermont where I live in the summer. So basically I went on all my social media and I said, if you buy a book from the Vermont bookshop today and text or show me the receipt, I will name a character after you if you want. And so I think it was like 20 or 25 names.
And they're all in the book?
They're all in the book. What I promised people
great.
was, you're going to be a really minor character, and I won't make you a jerk. Like, you're not. So most of them are like the people who are mentioned once or twice, or just super neutral minor characters. But then a couple of them started to grow into major characters I hadn't anticipated. And one of them was, I don't even actually know how she pronounces it, but Beth Doherty was a real person. And this is someone who, if you've read the book, has a long arc and is not always the best person. And I wrote back to her.
I was going to say, did you check in with the real
yes.
Bev?
This is
Okay.
like, 2 years later, I was like, so you might remember blah, blah, blah. And kind of explaining and saying, one thing that theoretically could happen also, just the way, libraries put all the books online and everything, meant, write-ups, people could be trying to Google you and find my book instead. And do you, if you have like a small business, is that something you're okay with?
Oh, right.
She was like, nobody ever Googles me. This is amazing. Please keep it.
Now I'm curious about who is the real Beth Doherty, but you don't have to say. What does it say?
Well, that's all I do. So I didn't know any of these people.
Okay.
Which was what was really fun because it was just a name. And so I was able to just I feel like names have so much power.
For sure.
There certainly are religious and cultural traditions where names literally, right, are believed to be infused with power. I don't come from any of those traditions, but I really believe that. And I can't write a character until I find the right name for them. I was stalled out for months because I couldn't figure out Bodhi's name, and then I came up with this really weird name. But those names just held so much potential. And then suggested entire characters. And I don't think I've ever met any of these people in person, but I've inscribed books to them that they ordered through bookstores and stuff. The weird thing was though, I forgot with a lot of them which names came from where, and then I'd go on Twitter, and one of my characters would respond to my tweet because this is how these people had found me to begin with. Was they followed me on Twitter. And so suddenly, this person who I have in here as someone on the crew team is responding to me on Twitter. And I'm going nuts. It was
So
starting to, and then I have to figure out what was happening. And oh yeah,
That's funny. So your book, it's very sly. So I can feel virtuous as a reader. I can tell myself I'm reading a novel that deals with violence against women, Me Too movement, class, race, sexism, but on a really basic level, I'm reading this book because I want to know who killed Thalia.
Yeah.
So are you trying to implicate the reader in some way with this book, and should I feel guilty for enjoying a novel about a murdered girl?
Right. I mean, that is a big question, right? That was on my mind. I think unlike that impossibility of Omar, this was sort of a contradiction that I was leaning into, right? Just that kind of worked itself out easily at the beginning, was I personally get drawn into reading true crime stuff or listening to those podcasts. Some of them are really responsible journalism, and they're really important. Some of them, other end of the spectrum, are lurid, unhelpful. Let's talk about Jeffrey Dahmer again. And I don't tend to be drawn into that stuff as much, but there's stuff kind of in the middle. And I mean, similarly, I think even with some of those things, I'm kind of feeling icky about this, but I'm also drawn in. And then sometimes there's some valuable, useful stuff to discuss in there, what happens to women who go missing on Native American reservations, and we need to talk about that more, or the way that domestic violence always escalates. That these things come out in podcasts that, some of our more modern media, this modern proliferation of media around true crime that would not get talked about on Dateline, right? Not as a topic of conversation, whereas in a podcast people might get into it. So that basically that mess or that dichotomy is already there for me just as a person. And I was just I'm just gonna lean into all of it as an author. I'm gonna write a story that I hope is propulsive, and that we have. It's not a traditional mystery in most ways, but we do have some little clues along the way. And at the end, like I said, we know who did it. But it's also going to talk about all the stuff that I really want to talk about. There's going to be a lot of spinach in the brownies, basically.
It's the best way to take our medicine.
Yeah.
So there is this sort of throwaway line that occurs occasionally throughout the novel. So it's this refrain that just pops up. So every once in a while, apropos of nothing, someone will just ask Bodhi, so who's watching your kids? So do you care to comment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that. Bodhi is definitely not me in really any way except that one. My kids are teenagers now, so I get this much less. But yeah, it's always a fascinating thing. I'd be on book tour, including for The Great Believers, before it came out, Penguin sent 4 authors together on a pre-publication tour to just meet with booksellers and things in different cities. We're like it was really fun. We were like a traveling band. So like every night a cocktail party in a different city, not the healthiest for a week. And there were 2 men and 2 women. All of us were parents. And one of these men had 5 children, in fact. And the 2 women every night at these cocktail parties, so who's watching your kids while you're doing all this? You must feel, you're so lucky that your husband, watches your children.
It's terrible.
You must miss them. You must miss them so much. You must miss them. Okay. And of course the men are getting asked, never. That was one, I needed to put it in. The one really awkward thing that has happened since then is that I've been, sometimes you since in the time since the book has come out, been in situations where, say, it's like a author, a benefit thing where you're like at a table or the author at the table, and some people have read the book and some people haven't, and this well-meaning guy who hasn't read the book says, "So who's watching your kids?" And the people at the table who have read the book are going,
"You gotta read the book."
And I'm just trying to be really neutral because I'm not going to be mean to this guy.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, you're nice, Rebecca. You're nice.
Try.
But we can start doing questions now, if that's okay?
Yeah, unless we had, did you want to, maybe. Yeah, unless maybe you want to, if we want to say anything else while
Can
we're
I
waiting.
ask
Yeah.
one question about?
Yeah.
So it's about the ending. So, and this is not a spoil at all, but so you end the book with this beautiful description of photosynthesis,
Yeah.
which I love, but that is preceded by this really visual filmic memory of Omar that suddenly pops into Bodhi's mind. And so he's jogging alongside Bodhi's crew boat. She's racing,
Yeah.
and they're really lagging far behind. And Omar's pacing them, he's urging them on, he's slowing down. When they slow down, he's pretending to be winded. And that actually is a scene that's really stayed with me. When I think of the novel, it's the first thing, like visually, that just pops into my head. So can you talk about why you decided to end with that image? I mean, you could have placed it at the beginning of the novel or in the middle.
Yeah.
And when did you write that scene, and why did you save it for the very end? It's so lovely.
Yeah,
It's,
and
it's
this is
a really
not a
nice
spoiler.
way to, no, it's not. Yeah.
No, you're gonna be like, oh my God, their crew boat was slow.
They were
That's
losing.
what happened. Thank you so much. No one asked me about that one either. It came really late, and it was, I think, I think I really wanted just a moment of grace. And I'll say very cryptically, I think, you've been thinking a lot about like what is the upswing at the end of the book and what's kind of bumming us out at the end of the book. And I needed, not necessarily a false hope for anyone involved, but a moment of grace and a moment of beauty. And also really, I think, one last moment of centering Omar, as much as he's been, the invisible center, but really, let's see him very clearly right at the end mattered a lot to me. We're not ending on Bodhi and her feelings, right? It's like this, we're gonna center this guy in this kind of moment of him doing something really lovely. Very, very close to the end as one of the landing notes.
It's perfect.
Thank
It's
you,
perfect.
thank
I
you,
loved it.
thank you.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. And it also ends, and it's a description of photosynthesis. So now I'm sure you're all riveted and really excited to find out. Promise it makes sense.
Questions, if you want to line up and you can ask questions.
Hello.
This is great. Is this working?
Is it working?
It doesn't sound.
Oh,
now
there
it's
we go.
Now
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
working.
yeah.
I'm curious because I've talked to you about your books over the years a few times, and your kids are getting older, and now that they're teenagers, have they read your work? And can they read your work? And do you have any little rules or thoughts about that?
That's a great question. Right, so my kids are 16 and 13. And the older one has started. Actually, no, she finally finished this book. As of a couple months ago, my answer was she has started 3 of them and not finished any of them. That is her reading MO, though, in general. Just, loves everything, wants to start a new book, and just, didn't get bored, just like started 50 books. But she finally finished this one, I think because, the mystery part. And I think it's also very weird when it's your mom. I think one thing that helped with this one too is she listened to it on audio. And she was saying it helped, just because she was able to do it while she was painting and stuff. I think it probably also helped because it's so clearly the actor's voice and not my voice. And I didn't say that to her, but I bet there was just that little bit of, she was able to hear it as someone else and not mom.
And the actor is
Thank you, I agree.
amazing.
So Julia Whalen is the narrator.
So
She
good.
is audiobook royalty.
Good.
And which I didn't really know when we got, but I think a lot of readers found the book because of her. Which, by the way, if you are an audiobook listener, as I am, there is this lovely app called Libro FM that is way better than Audible, and your money goes straight to your favorite independent bookstore instead of to Amazon. So I would highly recommend that. You can just delete Audible right off your phone and put this one on instead. It's a better app too. So. I really loved her work. And then we have this one other actor come in for Omar's voice for just one chapter, which I was very happy about. J.D. Jackson, this other actor. But yeah, so we'll see. I get though, it's like she's reading The Great Believers. Like, do you want to hear mom's gay sex scene? Is that really what you like? I don't know, yeah. But my policy on it has always been like they are welcome to read whatever they want. That same daughter apparently learned the F word when she was about 8 because I'd given them the back, like I don't like to waste paper. And the back of some old manuscript was like down there for them to color on in the basement. And a friend she had over started reading it, was like, your mom used the F word, and showed her. And so she's got a lot for the therapist. She's nice. There was one, yeah.
So I read the book and I loved it.
Thank
and
you.
there's one character that just so upset me, the young man that constantly makes comments to Bodhi that are so sexually harassing.
Yeah.
And she sits through it and nobody comes to her defense and no teachers say anything.
Yeah.
Nobody shuts him down. Now it was 20 years before and so
Yeah.
that wasn't the kind of training anybody had. And I was just wondering your inspiration in creating that kind of character, the comments he said, was that something, if that happened to me, you'd be like, what do I say? I'm just going to ignore it. I'm going to rise above it. I'm not going to push back. But I'm just curious to your thoughts on that.
Right, this character, this is Dorian, he is definitely an amalgam, right, of the many, many young men that most of us knew in some way or another. And I think what was important to me in making him was he's not out actually to hurt her. He's out to amuse himself and his friends, which I think if you look at the behavior of young men, they're just oblivious. And of course, in order to be thinking only of himself and his friends, he's seeing her as less than, right? That there's something. Oh yeah, get up to. There's something. It's not like he's just blithely innocent. But he was way too fun to write. It was like alarmingly fun to write or easy to write, right? Doesn't mean I approve of him in any way, but just, it came easily. He's also very disturbingly my husband's favorite character in the book, but I think for similar reasons, like he just likes the way that the characters put together. But yeah, that was I think I could have had that harassment spread out over many young men. That would have been one way to do it. But kind of centering it all in this one person and letting him kind of, represent all of that worked for me. Definitely not a name of some lovely person who bought from an indie bookstore. Would not have done that to anybody. Is there another?
So the part of the book that worked the most for me was how Beth Eckert and also how you come to see, Bodhi comes to see her life as a young woman differently through the Me Too movement, and even how you come to view Beth Eckert not as like a bully, but maybe even as someone who you're sympathetic
Right.
with, because you now maybe have the Me Too lens. I thought maybe you could talk about whether that was something you had done, just living and working in a boarding school and maybe getting some time and perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us were doing that, right? I think there were one really interesting part of Me Too, especially the earliest moments of Me Too, was the excavation that we were all doing. And Me Too as a hashtag, it was not about Harvey Weinstein and all that, right? It was about individual women saying, yeah, I was harassed on the job, or this happened in high school, or this happened in college. And I think for many of us, that was an opportunity. I think for basically, at least my experience was so many of these things I had not thought about in years, because it was normalized, or because I assumed it was somehow my fault, or any number of things. And then you start to realize, that stuff that, I thought I was supposed to put up with, but it really, really pissed me off. It turns out everybody else was also pissed off at the same stuff, just we weren't talking about it. The story I tell a lot now, and it was one I had not thought of for years until that early Me Too stuff, was my senior year of high school, in our senior lounge, this kid, whose name, of course, was Jason. There were some good Jasons out there. A lot of these kids were named Jason. But he, as a joke, exposed himself in the senior lounge. And there were, maybe 5 of us sitting around. And everyone else was like, ah! And I was the one person who went, ew, put that away. And I realized right away that was the wrong thing to do, because I wasn't down with the joke. And then the next day, and remember, I was a senior, the next day, a sophomore girl who I did not know came up to me in the hall and said, I know who you are. You're the one who was like, ew, ew. And she had heard this whole story. And what I internalized was I really messed up. I had the wrong reaction. Everything else was normal. I'm the weird one. And even the sophomore girl is even laughing at me. And just kind of, and then you put it in this file of things you never want to look at again. Not because of this guy exposing himself. That wasn't the alarming part, right? It was like, I'm so embarrassed by my reaction. And then, thinking back in those early days and going, wait a second, what was that? And then just, realizing that you absolutely weren't alone in that. That there were probably other, who knows, if you ask the other young women in the room who are now middle-aged women, what do you remember this? What do you remember? How did you feel about that? Probably very much more like how I felt about it than how it seemed at the time. All to say, I think we were all, and that includes men, looking back and going, oh God, I hope I didn't, whatever. And men can certainly be harassed as well. But we were all doing that excavation. We were all really going through it, and together, sometimes publicly, sometimes quietly, but definitely something that I think there are books that I write. Let me restart that sentence. This is a very personal book in that sense. Bodhi is not me, and there's the boarding school connection, but that's not really, I never left my boarding school basically, hers is about not having been back and coming back. She's really not me, but because of things like that, it feels personal in that I was writing it to work through stuff that was on my own mind. Not because anything in the book has happened to me, directly, if that makes sense.
How did you, invent the characters? Were they sort of questions you had and you wanted to have them sort of ask those too? Or were they an idea?
Yeah.
Or just a trait you wanted to explore, or sort of a personal experience of yours you wanted them to live?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are a lot of writers, and I am not one of them, who start with character. Who, you'll hear them talk and they're like, this character just appeared to me, this character just started talking to me and I didn't know who they were and I had to write down what they were saying. And then later, they have the work of trying to force that character into conflict of some kind or into some kind of interesting plot, which is hard because you like this person, this imaginary person now you have to force them to do something unhealthy. But I am the opposite of that, where all of my notes in my notebook are notes about plot. Like, what if someone was invited to a wedding and then it turned out that it's just the plot, it's not the people. And so my job, having put a bunch of those together into a bigger plot cloud, is to kind of reverse engineer my characters, especially my main characters. So for someone like Bodhi, I'm thinking, like, who is this person going to be? I knew I wanted, a woman. I knew I wanted someone my age. That's kind of it. And I need to think who's going to be the most susceptible to these circumstances? Who's going to be the most changed by these circumstances? Who's going to be vulnerable to these elements? I don't want someone who's just going to plow through like Superwoman. I don't want someone who's going to not be up to this challenge. So for instance, for Bodhi, I'm really needing to think about who's the person who has the skill set theoretically to think really critically about the way we frame stories and what the things we get wrong. And yet at the same time, she has not managed to turn those same critical skills onto her own past. And so who's that person going to be? And I need to form the character out of that. And I even, then I settle on, okay, she's going to be returning to teach, but what is she teaching? She could be teaching anything. And film history for me, it's like, okay, first of all, it's interesting. I like that better than writing about math for like 400 pages. But also, she's in that job of being a film historian, thinking about the way we tell stories, also about what we've gotten wrong in looking at like the actresses in the early Hollywood studio system. That's the person I want for this. For minor characters, sometimes it's more just I start with a name and one thing they're going to say, or what, okay, Thalia has these two friends, here are their names. And okay, I need a little bit, and then they grow and grow and grow from that. So it's very different ways, but in both cases, it's coming from the necessities of plot rather than from kind of feeling this person in some way. We have one more there, yeah.
I love the podcast named Starlit Fever. And I just wanted to know if that podcast if you had a muse podcast that you based Bodhi's on.
Thank you. Okay, so first of all, this is the one thing I cannot claim credit for the name. So Bodhi's podcast about women in the Hollywood studio system is Starlit Fever with a T. So the name first, what had happened, I had a name that wasn't as good for all the drafting process, which was Hollywoodland, which was the original name of Hollywood. And when I started the book, I checked to make sure there were no podcasts with that name because you don't want to be like implicating a real podcast, and there weren't. And then like 3 or 4 years later, I finished the book and we're in copy edits, and I check again, and now there are 3 podcasts called Hollywoodland. Shoot. So I actually went on Twitter. I swear I don't live my life on Twitter. I'm telling all these stories. And it was just like, hey, I need a name for a podcast that's about this stuff. Does anyone have any nominations? And I think 2 different people said Starlit Fever independently, but the one who said it first is thanked in the acknowledgments, because that is a way better name than I had. But yeah, no, I do love podcasts. There's a little bit of, there's a podcast called You Must Remember This, which is about Hollywood history and really gets into the social dynamics. And, it's not just, wasn't this movie great? It's like, let's talk about Spencer Tracy's alcoholism, that kind of thing. It's definitely not that podcast. I mean, she has a co-host, which this one doesn't. She's very specifically focused on the stories of women. But that might be the closest to an existing podcast that is out there about Hollywood history. Yeah, I would like to listen. If her podcast were real, I think I would like to listen to it. But sadly, it's not.